My name is Dr. G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Hello, my fellow unusual friends. Welcome to another episode of That's Unusual. You know, you could do me a big favor by going onto iTunes and Google Play and leaving me a review. It's my only way of understanding what you think of my episodes and my podcast series, and I'd love to hear what you think. You're in for a real special treat on today's episode. Have you ever asked the question, what is life? Well, even though we don't quite answer that question, I feel like my next guest, Joshua Cogan, and I cover off on just about every other philosophical question there is. If you don't know Josh, you should. He is quite possibly one of the greatest photojournalists of our time, who has won more awards than one can count. As a true citizen of the world, Joshua's thirst for curiosity, wonder, and exploration have taken him to the hidden corners of the earth to capture the stories of indigenous cultures through photography. On this episode, Josh and I talk about his unusual journey as a self-taught photographer, how he hustled his way at National Geographic to fame and recognition, the mental process he takes to capture rare emotions through his photos, what he has learned over the years in his photojournalistic career, the future of photographic storytelling, and even his most vulnerable life moments. Throughout our conversation, Josh and I go off on various philosophical tangents that I'm sure you will enjoy. This was hands down one of my favorite conversations to date. So join me today while Josh and I go deep into the meanings of culture, life, passion, resilience, work, happiness, and much more. And don't forget, as you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. Welcome to another episode of That's Unusual. My guest today is my good friend Joshua Cogan. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for having me.
I am great. I'm so excited to have you on here. I think you've got so many great stories that my listeners would love to hear. You know, you're one of the most accomplished and sought after photographers and photojournalists and storytellers, you know, really focusing on culture. But before we get into all of that stuff, you know, in your words, in one sentence or two, I mean, who is Joshua Cogan? How would you describe yourself?
Well, I think I've always actually struggled with that identity. I think I try to live in a lot of worlds, which is something that kind of shows up in my work. But, you know, I'm an anthropologist. I'm a photographer. I've kind of used visual mediums and other mediums as well, digital mediums, interactive mediums, to be able to tell stories about culture and cultural transition. You know, as I see it, we're in a time of incredible cultural change, which, you know, we have been for probably a good 10,000 years when we first became sedentary people. But this pace of which it's happening, the pace of rapid global change and loss of indigenous identities and other cultural identities has really sped up, especially in the last 50 to 75 years. And so I'm trying to capture origin stories, identities, and ways of operating and living in the world before they're lost or they transition to something else.
Yeah, almost cultures that are almost on the verge of extinction, which is so cool. And now someone doesn't accidentally just get into this type of space. So maybe take us back to a younger Josh, where you know, how did you get your start in photography, and specifically even around focusing on this element of culture?
I think actually, maybe to return a little bit to the pre-conversation we had, is I grew up in the burbs. You know, I grew up in the burbs of Atlanta, and to me, there was a profound lack of adventure there. No matter how many kind of newly built housing complexes I'd go explore in, or rivers behind the subdivisions or cul-de-sacs or any of these things, I was always kind of craving something that felt a little more adventurous or a little more kind of rich and experiential. And, you know, I think that originally led me into archaeology and anthropology, in no small part, definitely influenced by Indiana Jones as a kid, and also reading lots of National Geographic. My grandmother had every National Geographic from 1903 onwards up in her attic. And
yeah, we've got a big collection ourselves over here at home as well. Love National Geographic.
Yeah, so I really loved it and I really enjoyed it. And And I think, that was really a starting point for me. And then, I wasn't sure exactly what I'd do with myself. I had studied anthropology in college, actually, went into archaeology first, found it to be a little bit dry in terms of a lot of material culture, but not a lot of living, breathing culture. And, wanted something about the wet lab of human culture, kept drawing me. So I studied abroad in Jerusalem my junior year at college, kind of interested in exploring some of my own Jewish identity and being in the Middle East. And this was prior to the Second Intifada, so it was still pretty easy to roll around Jerusalem and a lot of the Palestinian territories and Arab territories. And you could move a little more freely. And that was really the thing that kind of made me grab a camera and start moving around. And it also gave me an excuse to hang out with people that were very different than me, even though that was probably a mental phenomena that was more within me. But to be able to go into the Arab quarter of the old city, it felt like having a camera gave me an excuse to be there. And really, it was just an opportunity or it was a device with which I would show interest in other people, that maybe if I lacked words, that kind of approaching them and wanting to document their experience allowed them to see that I was truly interested. And I think that to a certain degree, we all want to share our stories. We all want to be heard and be seen. It's a very fundamental part of kind of the human.
So did you have any formal training in photography at all?
I didn't, and I never did. I think the only class I ever took was for a couple of weeks in Israel. There was a basic SLR class, and I had bought a camera that I thought was an SLR at that time. So this is 2001. This is really before. Oh, sorry, this is in 2001. It's 97. So it was before the advent of digital photography, and I bought a camera that looked like an SLR, but really was a little bit more of a point and shoot. I didn't know the difference at that point. And I was working in downtown Jerusalem, and, obviously there's just lots of incredible and beautiful things to see constantly. And
so you pretty much immersed yourself in it and took the school of hard knocks in terms of understanding photography. What was it when you look through a lens? Like, what is it that you see that the rest of the world, perhaps doesn't see?
I don't know that I see anything that other people don't. I think for me, it gave me white noise. As a kid who had, I don't know if I was ADHD or pre-diagnosis, I was born in 76, but I had a lot of interest and, I had a lot of trouble kind of maybe focusing, and it literally gave me focus. It really gave me it kind of put blinders on. It kind of cut down on the intensity of information that I feel like I kind of receive on a daily basis. And it allowed me to kind of have a little bit of white noise. And from there, I think just explorations of light and personality and moments and emotionality and connection and all these things kind of come into a little bit more of just a focal point again.
Now, I mean, trying to capture, and we'll go down, I want to hear more about what happened next on your journey here, trying to capture human emotion in a photograph is not an easy thing to do, especially as your focus on capturing, cultures on the verge of extinction. Is there some different technique or approach or way of looking at the world in order to capture that essence?
Culture has a lot of physical manifestations and has a lot of invisible manifestations. And a lot of it's in how we see the world, how we construct the world around us, and how we construct ourselves in relation to that world. So I think seeing that is, I was kind of actually thinking about this the other day, is like what the process is for me. And that process is an immersive process, a deeply, deeply immersive process where I'm kind of letting go of my cultural framework a little bit and letting go of what I think is normal or what I would consider like to be kind of middle of the spectrum behavior, and allowing myself to submit to what kind of the rules that I'm operating under tell me to do. And a lot of that has to do with listening. A lot of that has to do with looking. A lot of that has to do with letting your mind go clear a little bit, because, culture is a very interesting thing, but in many ways it's a limitation. I do think that the culture it's almost like it's the adaptive tool that made humans so successful in many ways. So there is a lot of power and potential and beauty in culture. Obviously, it's what I try to capture and document. So there's so much I see in it that is of great value. But in our own culture, kind of stepping to someone else's, there's an opportunity to kind of put down and to be a clear vessel. And I think that's where I try to operate from when I'm shooting, is to try to be as clear a vessel as possible, or use it in relation to the myriad other cultures that I've spent time with, but not just a reference point to my own. You know?
I think obviously you've got tons of your photography, posted on your website, on different social media streams. I think what really draws me to a lot of your work is the fact that when I'm looking at your pictures, I get a feeling, right? And it's hard to have a picture tell or evoke some sort of emotion or feeling when you look at it, but it's almost like you can put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're taking a picture of. And I think that's it's a very incredible skill to have. And it's really cool. And I encourage people to go and take a look at some of your photos if they haven't. I do want to go back before we get too far into our conversation about specifically around cultures and so forth. But so you're in Israel. You're playing around with an SLR camera, getting into the places that you want to. What happened next? What was your journey after that?
I came back, I was heading back into my senior year of college. I didn't really know what I wanted to do in my life. I had degrees in archaeology and biological anthropology, and I was generally fascinated with the world, but had very few skill sets with which to make a living in it. And I essentially kind of came out a highly trained bartender. And I traveled around for a few years. I lived out west for a year in the mountains. I was kind of interested in exploring that, and I lived down in the U.S. Virgin Islands in St. Croix, and that in those places I started. I did more and more shooting and got more and more interested. And then I decided a couple of years after college, I'd kind of like taken my personal time and needed to kind of get down to work, and I moved to D.C. and I had this fascination with the notion of working at National Geographic, as many do. Now, I didn't really necessarily think I'd be a photographer. I had wanted to do writing or research. I had multiple undergraduate degrees and had a good eye for research, and certainly had a strong affinity with geographic growing up, and so I decided I'm just going to move to DC and I'll get a job there. Now, I hadn't really thought much about what would that require, or that everybody else wanted to work there, or the fact that it was 2001 and the magazine industry was really starting to take a pretty massive hit at that point. Mm-hmm. Advertising revenue was dropping through the floor. Everything was going online. The advertising marketplace and the rates for those, really were crashing as well. And Geographic, like most other magazines, are receiving the bulk of its income from car advertisements. And those started going online more and more. And so, that all to be a long story short, saying that there weren't really a lot of jobs to be had, no matter how well I had graduated or how well qualified I seemed to be for any given position. I couldn't seem to get one, mostly because they were in massive hiring freezes. They were laying people off, and there was an incredible amount of competition coming in. And, so basically I tried to come into the industry during a massive transition in the industry. Mm-hmm. And I went after one job, another job, was having no luck, was bartending at night to make a living. And then at one point, my grandmother said, and so this is probably going to sound weird, but answering the first question that you might ask at the end, this may be ahead of time, but the best piece of advice I ever received was, nobody can turn down free work. Mm. So I was talking to my grandmother, and I was, kind of lamenting, having been in here in DC for a couple of months and not feeling like I was making any headway, and I didn't understand why, and this and that. And she was like, well, you should just go in there and volunteer. Nobody can turn down free work. Well, it turns out she was right, that nobody could turn down free work. And so I went into the film labs there, where they were taking all the film in and processing, because they still were film based at that point. And I said, hey, I'm here to work for free. Nobody really understood what that meant. They couldn't, they were like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, we don't really have a volunteer program. The only volunteer program we have is for usually retirees. They're doing ushering at the events that they have in the auditorium. So they would have National Geographic explorers and all these kind of come and speak. And a lot of retirees sometimes would volunteer there and help people get to their seats. That was the only thing they had. Otherwise, they had an internship program. But I just walked into the volunteer office the next day. I used a tacit sign off on somebody who was running the photo lab to get in there. And then I got in there. And what that led to was a lot of free film and a lot of free processing and a lot of access to photographers' film that was coming through off the processing machines. Mm-hmm. I got to see photos coming back from some of my heroes like David Duboulet and David Allen Harvey and the stuff coming fresh from the field. And it was invigorating and dispiriting at the same time. You get to see how good these guys were, but you also got to see that they weren't always that good. They would take a lot of bad photos too. And so for somebody who, would only see the finished project in the magazine, to see that these guys were also human was empowering. And I did that for a few years. And then basically at a certain point, I was like, well, this isn't necessarily going to get me anywhere. I'm still bartending. I'm still volunteering. I need to go off and tell stories. And so I chose a story to go tell, which was in southern India. It was a very old Jewish community in southern India, which was the very first story I really went off to do by myself.
So before we get to that, did you just learn through observation and looking at some of the people that you looked up to, or did people take you under their wing and help you train you over your time at Nat Geo?
I never really had a proper apprenticeship, which is something that I always really wish I'd had, but I didn't. To a certain degree, I do feel like the model of apprenticeship doesn't exist in the same ways in our society. And I also think it exists in some ways for those that are very financially privileged. And so it's kind of a blessing in disguise for you, because to some degree you just created and carved your own style and your own path forward. Absolutely. And I think everything is that way. Everything is like an opportunity that you can't really see coming sometimes. You're just adapting, and then you're kind of standing out from the crowd. And as somebody who, I never really actually liked competition, which is one of the more difficult parts about the field, is it is a very competitive field and continues to be in a very small field. I think that just continuously cutting away from where everyone else is eventually leaves you standing alone and having something that other people don't have sometimes. And so, I think there's a lot of opportunity that also comes with the challenges that exist within those. I mean, there's so many good lessons embedded in that hustle of you coming through Nat Geo and really carving your way, messages and lessons around, just following what you're passionate about and just being, doggedly determined to make it work, being very persistent and doing things slightly different. And I think, there's so many messages sort of wrapped up into your story, which is really cool. So you leave Nat Geo, you go to India. What happened there? I interrupted you at that point. Well, I'd gone over there to explore this. At this point, I don't ever like using last or extinct or anything, but this a Jewish culture that had been waning for many, many years in southern India and Kerala. And, I don't know how much of the story or the full story you want, but I was going to go head down to Cochin, which is an old spice port off the southwest coast of India in the Kerala state. And I got to India, and I was going to go for about a 2-month total. And about a week into my first trip, I was heading towards Varanasi on a train from New Delhi to do some traveling before I went down to Kerala to eventually start working on the story. And I got robbed on the train of everything I had brought with me except my film. So all the camera gear that I had spent all those years saving up for, and all the lenses and my passport, my traveler checks, and all those things got swiped from me. Oh, that sucks. It really sucked. And I was pretty destitute. I was kind of having one of those Captain Dan moments in Forrest Gump where I was like, you call this a storm? I mean, I was already, one of the big progenitors of me going to that trip when I was 25 was I was pretty heartbroken to begin with. And I was like, I'm going to make my way in the world. I'm going to do this thing. And this is going to prove that I have worth in some way or another. And then I got kind of smacked with that one. So that really hurt. At that point, all you can do is run, Forrest. Just run. Oh, man. It went bad. It was bad. So I remember talking to my mom, my dad. My mom basically said to me, both my parents are divorced, but they had different kind of responses. My father was like, I knew this was going to happen to you. Why don't you just come home, And my mother was like, if you come home now, you're never going to end up doing photography as a career. You're going to give up on yourself. So we'll figure out how to get you another camera over there. So eventually, after sitting around Delhi for a month, which is not the place you want to be in India, at least for me, or the least magical places, although it has its own magic, I eventually ended up getting some more gear and went down to Kerala to tell this story. And as could be suspected, the story wasn't as straightforward as I had hoped it was going to be. When you're kind of searching out communities that are waning or having, say cultural lapses, I try to stay away from like dying cultures, because I do think that I don't think that cultures die in the way that we like to think that they do. I actually think that's a fairly neo-colonialist perspective. I think that it transfers and sublimates and forms and regroups. It's a very active thing. I mean, culture is like DNA, and genes kind of link and combine and become new things. So but in the case so they evolve into something different that just doesn't look like the culture it was before. Yeah, we can't really understand it.
No, but what about that assignment? So I'm just thinking of like Tomorrow We Disappear, which is a big, incredible, film project that you guys had worked on. It was a town of magicians in India, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And that was literally being bulldozed down. Is that sort of a disappearance of culture, or would you still consider that an evolution, just changed over the course of time?
Well, but there was all these things happening in that story prior to the bulldozing. And the bulldozing apparently still hasn't happened. It's been ongoing and ongoing. But, the story that we ended up saying is like, it's very easy to set up a protagonist-antagonist thing. Indigenous itinerant culture of magicians and wanderers and puppeteers and fire breathers settles down. Big money developers come in, knock down their colony that, had gone from jungle to tent to clay village to brick and mortar that had eventually gotten swallowed up by New Delhi as a whole. But the story was much more complex than that, right? Because traditional puppetry, traditional magic shows, all these things were starting to lose favor anyway, right? So if there were a real cultural commodity, right, if people were really paying attention to what they were doing, they would have a larger political voice, they would have more money, they would have greater possibility, perhaps where they were living in wouldn't have kind of turned into the overcrowded area that it was, where they were having issues with electricity.
But was it part of the Untouchable crew? Was it an untouchable community? Like in India, they have the Untouchables, which is sort of the lowest caste system.
The artist caste is an interesting thing. They're not considered untouchables, but they are lower caste.
Gotcha. Okay.
But, it's interesting because like within them, there are Muslims and there are Hindus. So they're not actually also perfectly subscribing to the caste system as we would understand it, But at the same time, these are also, even if you want to say it, these are people in a lower caste that are getting flown all over the world to meet heads of state. They were making the president of the U.S. They were performing in the Kennedy Center. They were performing on the Mall. They were going to Abu Dhabi, right? So India, obviously valued them to a certain extent as a cultural export and saw that they had value. But back home, they weren't even allowed to perform on the streets sometimes, right? Because they would be considered beggars in that case. Mm-hmm. So these things are incredibly complex, right? And there's larger cultural pressures that are playing into any individual culture. All right. And how they define themselves into where they fit in.
So it's just, these stories are just so fascinating, and how you capture them in photographs is even more fascinating. Having known you for some time, you disappear for months at a time, and you don't just go on site, take some photos and come back. You immerse yourself in the culture. Walk us through your thought process there. Why is that so important to you, and how do you think that impacts the work that you do?
I think it kind of stems to, even those childhood stories of kind of growing up in the suburbs, of wanting to know what else was out there and being profoundly unsatisfied with what I kind of saw as cultural norms here in the States. And I think a lot of us are in one way or another. We may point to one thing or another, the kind of the existential class of the middle class milieu, But, for me, I felt like there was a life out there that was like richer and more filled with stories and more filled with magic and wonder and different ways of doing things and different notions of community,
Do you feel like putting yourself in the shoes of the people that you're photographing? Does that perhaps provide a better lens into what you should be capturing on film?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to always figure out what the spectrum is. So when you submit yourself something completely, right? Because we as humans want a certain amount of predictability and control and kind of understanding what's happening around us, right? It's our nature, right? It's like, I've been actually toggling with this notion a lot back and forth when I kind of think about culture. And I've been thinking a lot about indigenous cultures, hewing much closer to what truth and reality is, right? And so hold on with me for a bit here. So I've been thinking about this kind of apocryphal story of Adam and Eve, right? And this notion of leaving the Garden of Eden, right? This whole thing of, they say it was the first police state that, God said, you got this whole thing, you got this Garden of Eden, all the food's going to be there for you. You can walk around naked, You can live in total harmony with everything around you. Just don't eat from this one particular tree.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we go and eat from the particular tree.
Yep.
Right? And the notion is that that was the cost of living in complex society, right? That was the cost of having a little more certainty in the world around us. But in that engagement, that we lost something about like the mystical, unbound nature, the non-dual nature of what the Garden of Eden was, right? That everything was kind of sacred and living and real and breathing, and everything had life, and this is essentially, if you kind of look at that in a cultural lineage, that's an animist culture, right? Where everything is kind of sacred and alive. Now, my most recent project in Thailand, I was living with an indigenous village in northern Thailand, and it's a shamanic culture. So, and it has aspects of kind of Buddhism in it. There's a lot of kind of syncretism that comes in with obviously the cultures that are around it, and that it's in Thailand. It has a lot of exposure to Buddhism. This is probably a culture that actually originally passed through. The name of the tribe is called the Lahu, and they probably originally passed through China, having come from Tibet. So if you listen to some of their origin stories, they sound like a lot of the Tibetan indigenous cultures. And the way they see the world is much more mystical. So if there's a sickness or there's an illness or something, they'll go to the shaman. The shaman will, maybe he'll do some prayers. Maybe he'll walk out into nature and listen to see what's happening. If there's an illness or something like that, or there's discord in the village, they actually sometimes will do an animal sacrifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we in like kind of Western or monotheistic faith say, oh, animal sacrifice, how backwards, how dirty, how would you make an animal like pay for your sins? But really they're just eating the pig that they killed, right? And they're not doing sacrifice any more than when we kill a pig at a factory farm here. Mm-hmm. But they're actually elevating its life to a level of certain amount of sacredness by doing this. So they're living in a world where everything has an exchange, and they're living in an organic, dynamic, and ever-changing fluid consciousness of what's going around them. And because of that, I feel like everything seems more alive. That to a certain degree, that there's a certain amount of kind of a technicolor aspect. And when I spent time with indigenous cultures, and when I spent time with cultures that tend to have very different kind of social cues or structures or systems that are different than ours, what that is doing to my brain is it's bringing it alive, right? When I don't understand how things are working around me, I'm working overtime. It's like being a child again,
mm-hmm.
right? Like you can't necessarily understand somebody's language or the thing they're trying to put in your mouth for you to eat, or why they're telling you to do something, or how they're telling you to dress, or any number of things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, as you submit yourself to that process, it's like almost landing on a different planet, right? If you're really in it. And what you can do is you can cling more tightly to the things that you know, because it gives you a certain amount of comfort and control over what's around you. But I think with that comes a certain amount of less aliveness, right?
Yeah.
And I think as we go through to that which is new and completely submit ourselves to it, right, as we release control, we become more alive. So, sometimes I never feel more alive than when I'm in with one of these cultures and having fully submitted myself to the process. Because everything's firing, every hemisphere of my brain, right? Whereas I come back home to DC and I have my habits and I have, my little routine in the morning. I put on a podcast and drink some coffee and do some stretching, or
mm-hmm.
Walk my dog. But all that stuff is so hardwired into my brain development.
Mm-hmm.
Inherently, I'm also a lot less creative in that space.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's so much part of rote and routine. And I think we do this through life in general too. I can even, I can watch myself as a human being. Like, I think we all like this. The older we get, the more we want the familiar, right? Yeah. We want to stop pushing outside of our boundaries constantly. But I think that's no small part, a bit of a spiritual death. And I think it gets harder for me to go out in the field as I get older, It gets harder for me to submit myself to pride. It gets harder for me to challenge my own ideas of like how things should be.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we have to proactively seek out those uncomfortable and unfamiliar moments. I actually think the opposite. I think the older I get, the more I actually want to immerse myself in the unfamiliar and the unexpected. Mm-hmm. Perhaps I'm an outlier, but I certainly don't get the inspiration from just sitting doing the routine and the mundane, but really putting myself in those types of, unknown cultures and unfamiliar environments. Is there, I mean, if looking back at all of the assignments and excursions that you've gone on, is there any story or experience that you can pinpoint that truly touched your soul, like really had an impact on you personally?
They all do. I mean, I know that's a little bit of a cop-out, but they all really touch me. And sometimes after the fact, I think the camera serves as a little bit of shield from what I'm experiencing in the moment. There's a lot of emotional intensity in a lot of the different things that I cover. Depending on how deep you want me to go, there was a very kind of powerful moment for me a couple of years ago. And this wasn't a straight culture story, but I was in Lake Kisumu area of Kenya, which is Kenya's second largest town. I was down there working on some maternal health projects for a different client. So I'll take on a lot of projects that have strong cultural cues, but aren't necessarily just culturally oriented, right? So this one was for a group that was trying to work on maternal health and mortality issues that were going on in southern Kenya. And we were at one of the hospitals there. I wouldn't actually say hospital. I think clinic is probably a more appropriate word. And we were there working and shooting during the day, shooting with some of the mothers and some of the nurses. And a man came in with another man over his shoulder that had just been hit by a bus. I think he had a motorcycle or scooter. I don't know if he had a helmet on, but either way, he had a pretty massive skull trauma. Couldn't really tell what was going on, but they brought him inside, and he was just kind of gasping for breath. He was unconscious, and he really reeked like booze very strongly. And they brought him to the clinic because it was the closest thing to a healthcare system they had nearby. And they brought him in and they were like, listen, we need to get him an x-ray. He's got internal trauma, whatever it is. We can't know what's going on here. Can you take him in your vehicle? Right. And my first question, somewhat innocently, was, is there an ambulance or something that could get him there quicker? And to receive a scoff in return, there's no ambulances here. This is all there is. And so we threw him in our vehicle and we drove for about an hour and a half till we got to the central part of town. We took him to a hospital and we got rejected. They said, we can't do anything for him here, with a very straight face. And me, I'm in kind of a little bit of a mental crisis mode at this point. We have this guy that really dying in the back of our vehicle. We get to another one, same issue. We get to a third one, same issue. Finally, a fourth hospital can admit him and can do head x-rays. And he was in the same condition when we got him there as when we picked him up. I mean, he was still gasping for breath. I don't know if he made it. We stayed around for a few hours. And that was it. And I went to my hotel that night, and I tell that story. I've seen a lot of really tough things over the years, and I would say what I end up covering is a lot of slow burn crises rather than trauma. I have friends that do war photography and conflict photography, and to me, they're incredibly brave souls, but I could never handle that level of witnessing that amount of sheer pain, but I do witness a lot of slow burn crisis, as I said, and a lot of human suffering and human pain. And this was this really like intense and apocryphal moment for me, where I went back to the hotel that night and I couldn't stop crying for a long time. And I sat there with a little bit. I listened to as many meditations as I could. I called my mother. I called my girlfriend at the time. I was reaching out to everyone I could to try to help kind of grasp my head. And what coming up for me is a lot of just the inherent inequalities in the world, right? I mean, it's something that I was always witness to and always attuned to, but something about witnessing that physical trauma, that real direct one-on-one, as opposed to slow burn physical trauma or disease. I do a lot of work around infectious disease. Just being there for that moment just really shook whatever had been building in me loose. And it was, the beginning of what I would say, this is probably like 3.5 years ago. It was a big watershed moment for me in how I conceived my own work and why I was doing the things that I was doing and why I could see the way I see. And I think maybe the deepest answer in here, as opposed to getting into the general injustice of the world, of which I think there is a lot. I think the world is very imbalanced in a lot of ways, is how we are able to see it around us. And I think that my attunement to certain topics of kind of cultural loss and marginalization and, my own perceptions of people not hearing, heard, or seen in the world was my own experiences around those things, and my own experiences of trauma, growing up, and generational traumas in my family, and these type of things. And I think that's what allows me to see what I see. And that's a big story to say that, our realities are often constructed by our experiences. And if we have experiences of ways of seeing things, we're likely going to be attuned to be able to kind of pull out those details in the world around us. That in some ways our own experience is a cipher for how we live in the world. And I think my ability to see kind of certain stories, and my ability to draw out certain things from people, and my ability to interact with certain people is due in no small part by having shared or been part of experiences that would be similar to their own in different ways. Mm-hmm. I'm not a woman living in Malawi that is having to travel 300 miles on the back of a tobacco truck to deliver a baby. I can never be. But I've had my own experiences in my own life that allow me to understand what it's like to be in pain, and what it's like to be in suffering, and what it's like to not seen or not heard. And I think those are the things that I especially attune to.
Yeah, I mean, seeing those moments of suffering it's a very visceral and vulnerable experience, to say the least. I mean, trauma. I mean, I personally remember my first trauma patient that I saw when I was a medical student, and I was doing trauma surgery. And that visual just never, and that feeling actually just never ever leaves, and it has a significant impact. I mean, we call it trauma. It's trauma for the patient, but can also be traumatizing to the person experiencing it. And I recall my first trauma patient that I saw, it happened to be a young teenage girl who attempted to commit suicide by jumping off of Key Bridge. But when she jumped off of Key Bridge, she missed the water and hit a pavement. Ugh. And she actually happened to come into the ER alive with practically every bone in her body broken. Ugh. She ultimately didn't make it, but it's still, I can picture every sound happening around that moment to this day. And that was 20 years ago.
And how deeply hardwires that into your own kind of experience in the world.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm doing a bit of an oral history project around Walter Reed Military Hospital right now. It was in the neighborhood here now. And it's been closed down for 10, 15 years since around the wrap up of the Gulf War. And I've been interviewing some of the physical therapists, the PTs that work there. And, once the war started, they started seeing, enormous amounts of physical trauma coming through the doors. So, but, what had historically been single leg amputees then became double and triple and quadruple amputees. And they would have anything from 100 to 150 patients at a time. I mean, there was no trauma unit in the world that was probably seeing this type of traffic coming through. And they were basically going nonstop, 24 hours a day until they closed down the military hospital a number of years later. And then all of them went off to different areas. The war kind of wound up. The amount of amputees coming back from the Gulf War were far less, and they were doing far more quieter jobs. But all of them have been suffering. Talking to them, all of them have actually suffered some pretty deep wounds from that time since. And they weren't the ones that were, directly traumatized. Secondhand trauma is also very real. And I think about that in terms of generational traumas as well. I mean, they've showed so much how biochemistry hardwires through generation. There was this really interesting study about children of Holocaust survivors. So there was a hotline in New York on in the 80s. I would have to actually get the reference point on this, but it was a Harvard team that did this hotline for Holocaust survivors in New York in the 80s. And what they found is that the people were calling up were the children of the Holocaust survivors. And they were describing all the same PTSD as you would expect from a direct survivor. And so, how we kind of pass this down generation through generation is also something that I've become very interested in. And is a topic that's kind of receiving more and more and more kind of research, but it's not something that would necessarily line up with our understanding of evolution or genetic passing, right? It's almost like Lamarckian evolution to a certain extent. Say, oh, you cut off the giraffe's tail, and now the next generation of giraffes won't have tails. We know that not to be true, but with biochemistry and epigenetics, we are starting to see that behavioral attributes can actually be passed down.
So true. These are, there's some, well, the Walter Reed stories. I mean, I did some training over there as well. And it was, just the amount that happened in that institution. It's too bad it shut down. But, yeah, I mean, the amount of stories that came out of Walter Reed was just fascinating. I did some research over at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology around sudden infant death syndrome. And they used to have this lab down underneath where you saw some of the strangest traumas preserved over the course of time. It was just a strange yet exciting and scary place all at once. But all right, I want to take a little bit of a 180-degree turn here. But getting back into the photography. Over the past, since you started at 2000, 2001, and you picked up your first SLR camera, technology has changed significantly since then, right? So there's so many citizen photojournalists or citizen journalists that are out there. What's your take on basically anyone being able to pick up a camera and capture stuff? Is it becoming commoditized, or is this a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think these things have always been changing. I came into photography at a time where everyone was like, you're never going to be able to make a living, right? At that point, journalism was dying, and the rates that you were getting for photography were going down significantly. I managed to eke out a living over the years doing it. And I do think that it's also been always one of the most democratized arts, right? Everyone always wanted to be a photographer,
That's true.
And the camera was the thing that anyone could pick up, right? And anyone could be an artist. It takes, to a certain degree, the barrier to entry is very low with photography compared to other things. There is the cost, right? Compared to a pencil or drawing, something like that, the cost of a pen and a piece of paper are very cheap, and a camera is expensive, but you can usually get to a level of decency with photography with a lot less practice than you would to, paint something decent or draw something decent, right? Because you're
so how would you define? I mean, what in your words or in your viewpoint, how would you define a good photo versus a bad photo, or is there such thing as a bad photo?
No, I don't know. That would be a very difficult thing for me. I don't know that I could get into that level of thing. The thing that I hear about my work that people most often tell me is they feel that they're really there. They feel that they're really connected to the people in the photos, that there's a sensuality to them. I like a certain amount of sensuality in the photos. I think, I look at a lot of photography that's out there, and even some of the very, very successful people. And there's this kind of border between fine art and documentary. And it seems that we're treating people like objects in those photos, that there's a certain amount of almost making fun of them in a cultural elitism.
I feel like any piece of art, I feel like it's not just the art itself, but it's the story and the journey behind that piece of artwork that I think contributes a lot to what makes a great picture, or what makes a great, canvas oil painting, or whatever it might be. It's I don't know. I mean, for some reason it's, and this is sort of where your expertise comes in, is that every photo that you take, there's a significant story behind it, and you might be able to replicate a photo, but you can't replicate that story.
Right. And that's where the richness is, for me, I want a deep, deep meaning. And I think that's where kind of culture comes in, right? It adds layers and layers and layers and layers of meaning that we can't necessarily understand. And so I think, to say what is good or what is bad, that's a very difficult thing. But does it have meaning in one way or another? And then, I think anything's valuable in a way, I was going to kind of make reference to the point of everything, everything going on Instagram, those things, that does have a lot of challenges. And I do think, there's, I don't know. I think there's differences between learning how to really play guitar or keyboard, and then, having a machine that can make all the beats and the sounds for you. I think that's existing within all our fields, right? That to be good at something actually takes a certain amount of less work, because the technology is getting to the point that it makes everyone raise the bar a little bit.
But in the same sense, I still have I still have my
Yeah.
12-inch records, and I'm a fan of vinyl when it comes to DJing, but you've got all these, modern electronic equipment that can self-match the beats and so forth. I mean, to some degree, like, we want to hang on a little bit to that old school way of doing things, but is this similar to what you were talking about in terms of a cultural evolution? Like, is photography itself going through a cultural evolution in which the means by which we capture stories through photography are fundamentally changing because we all pick it up through our phones?
I mean, I think, that's a deep conversation going a lot of different ways, right? That maybe we're getting to the point that, like, if you want to talk about if all communication is language in one way or another, and increasingly, like, through these devices, we're becoming less verbal, right? And those tendencies towards less kind of verbose dynamics can come from a bunch of different ways, right? So you can say, okay, there's, just like writing, there's like, we're inundated with information in these days, right? There's clickbait articles everywhere, or even complex magazines like The Economist or The Atlantic or The New Republic, or these things that used to be like really deep essays, like they're becoming shorter and more brief, right? Because they can't sell as much, right? So like all of media is trending in the direction of kind of clicking and getting people's attention. And okay, there's a few outliers that are going into like, going against the grain, as there are in any medium. But so let's say all that's happening, right? So things are becoming less verbose and they're becoming more visual, right? That provides an interesting notion, right? Because to a certain degree, our development in communication was to become increasingly verbal over many generations, right? So if you look at tribal or indigenous or animistic cultures, their use of language isn't nearly as, the diversity of language sets doesn't tend to have as much broader range with them, right? And that's one of the things that I noticed between like shamanic cultures or like monotheistic cultures is like the sheer amount and the intense amount of language, where there's like indigenous cultures, they can say kind of simple phrases or speak a lot less, and it can mean a lot more things. Maybe that's where we're getting with imagery in general. Maybe as we become increasingly visual, we're becoming less verbal. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. That's tough to know. As somebody who maybe had a lot of trouble like sitting down and reading from books as a kid or just studying in the traditional ways, but was much more interactive. I mean, I leaned into photography because I liked a much more interactive and dynamic experience that I can pick up a lot. I can pick up a lot of information from a photograph, and like weird information. Sometimes without a lot of descriptors, I can tell where a photograph is taken in the world, or a certain type of light, what time of day it is in the afternoon. And that's just from taking millions and millions of pictures and having kind of professionally watched the world for now 20 years, So would you say you're embracing a lot of this new digital media and technologies that are coming out in photography? And if so, how has that changed the way you do your work? It has. I mean, I do embrace them. I do enjoy them. I mean, Instagram to a certain degree is like the gamification of photography,
the clicks and the
which
likes.
Which is weird. And it's like, yeah, going after likes and like trying to get somebody's response. And so obviously I think there's a lot of negative aspects to kind of living in the world like that, or living as an artist like that. I think it can kind of take away that notion of like going to the mountain and sitting up there for 2 years and learning something and then bringing it back down. I do enjoy it. I also I also have seen the economic impacts of it. Certainly when you have a lot more people producing a particular commodity, the value of that commodity inherently goes down, or the value of that commodity is much more based on popularity than skill in some ways. Although they aren't mutually exclusive many of the times. Sometimes some of the greatest photographers have the greatest followings. Sometimes they don't, and I guess maybe that's how it's always been. But what it has allowed me to do is get back to the pure process of it. And while I don't get paid for Instagram at all, and I do it purely out of love. And there are certain concerns, as I kind of look at the field and I see what's happening and how it's developing over the years. I also do recognize that it is a challenge also to be in kind of pure joy and inspiration, to share what is really true to you. And the barriers between you and your audience are in some ways erased and washed away. Now, having access to the big platform guys like National Geographic or Time or any of those things is always going to serve you well. I don't know. I kind of seen these from a different way. There's a lot of conversation that getting an organic audience on Instagram is virtually impossible these days because of the sheer number of people that are on the platform. To kind of get any attention to pull it out of the morass is very difficult. But, I guess that doubles down on my challenge to find what it is about photography that really drives me, and the things that come purely from my soul when I'm not having to serve anyone except, my own beliefs about what is important to be shared and valuable in the world, and to see if I can find an audience that resonates with that.
So that said, what's next on your journey? What's the next chapter for Joshua Cogan?
Well, I think right now, I'm April 6th, I turned 41. So I'm in, the second half or the second third or, whatever in life. I'm a grown ass man. I got gray hair to prove it. I see the younger guys coming and they scare me. They're really good, and they're really hardworking. They're hard dedicated. And, you get to 40 and you got to start choosing your targets better,
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, there actually has been a certain amount of process of slowing down and choosing my targets a little bit better, but wanting to commit myself to deeper long-term projects. One of the things that's been coming up for me a lot is around sacred spaces. Through a couple of projects I've done around Indigenous cultures, I've seen how many of the places that they consider to be sacred or of great spiritual value to them have been either taken, grabbed, or built over by more Western-rooted cultures. I'm thinking specifically of a Tairona man in Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta, which is in the northeast coast of Colombia, and a large collection of indigenous peoples. And for them, like many of the indigenous people throughout the world, where rivers and water confluences come together are very sacred. And I have this shot of a gentleman, it's actually on the website, I believe, but there's a shot of a gentleman standing at the last place where they have access to where a river and sea come together there. All the other ones have been bought up by developers or turned into hotels, right? Because indigenous people don't have titling to land in the way that you and I would, right? I mean, a lot of the issues that are going on around Standing Rock were essentially like, that was all treaty territory, but there was nobody there to actually like take legal frameworks to courts as ranchers and different people started taking over Sioux Nation territory. Right. Well, that's been happening all over the world for a really long time, right? Because they don't have a land lease on it. For them, that seems like a ridiculous notion. They've lived there forever, right? Before our legal frameworks were ever even developed. And so I've really kind of gotten into this notion of starting to document those in a more deep and authentic way.
So if you had one last assignment that you could do, what would you want to do that you haven't done?
I don't know if I have a specific one right now, but it would be a pilgrimage. I think for me, a lot of my work is also, talk about submitting to the process. It is the process of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is both an inward and outward process. And I deeply value the transformations that happen to me as I do these ones. Now, I don't know specifically which one that would be. I'd actually have to spend a little time thinking about that right now.
No worries. Well, we covered a lot of ground and fascinating stories, Josh. So I think this might be a good segue into sort of the closing element of our conversation, which is what I call the rapid fire lightning round, where we'll do two things. We'll do word association, then we'll do a Mad Lib fill in the blank.
All right,
let's get started. So with word association, I'll give you 6 words, one at a time. And as soon as I say the word, tell me the first word that comes to your mind. All right?
Sure.
All right, first one, love.
All beings.
Mm-hmm. Hate.
I think I see more of a vision. I'm a visual person, but I see a big kind of like knotted mass of blackness. I don't think I have a word for it.
All right. Well, that's your visual of hate. Good. All right. Wonder.
Open sky with streaming morning light.
Nice. Yeah,
I'm a visual guy.
Definitely a visual. That's good. That's good. I like that. All right. Passion.
Purpose.
Mm-hmm. Opportunity.
Possibility.
Okay. And the last one for you, regret.
Forgotten.
Forgotten. Oh, I love that. Very cool, man. All right, let's go into the Mad Lib fill in the blanks. So the first one you actually already answered, which was the best piece of advice I ever received. And you said, nobody can turn down free work, which I love that answer, but you're not going to get away with already having given an answer. So I'm gonna replace that with another one.
Well, the one I always say is freedom is low overhead. Freedom
is low overhead. That's pretty cool. I like that. All right, so we get two pieces of advice, but I'm still going to replace it with another one. And the other one is, I get my inspiration from
people.
Yep, I can see that. All right, looking back, what would you tell your 20-year-old self?
Try not to worry so much.
Were you a big worrier back in the day?
Yeah, I'm still a big worrier.
All right, so if you had to write a book about yourself, essentially an autobiography, the title of the book would be?
Things That Others Reminded Me.
Things That Others Reminded Me. Explain.
Well, I think, I think the TED Talk I gave is Things We Forgot.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm currently kind of in the process of doing some deeper writing with portraits of stories or people that I've done, and then the lessons that I've learned in those. But I realize that I'm always like learning the same lessons, and myself always having to remind myself of the same things. And so it seems to be that we're all born with a certain amount of innate knowledge, but we have to constantly be reminded, because I think we live in cultural frameworks that maybe like push some of our best notions outside of us, as we get kind of stuck in this notion of trying to make it or survive or be successful. So I think what's happening is every time I'm meeting somebody, they're reminding me of something I should already know or do already know, but maybe have stopped practicing.
All right. Makes good sense. Cool. All right. 2 more for you. Next one. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and what would you want to talk about?
Prince.
Okay.
Stevie Wonder.
Mm-hmm.
And Herbie Hancock.
All 3 musicians. All right. Tell me more. Why those 3 and what would you want to talk about?
Because I think somebody told me a story once about their friend was a chef or Prince's private chef or something like that. And that, one night those 3 guys were having dinner at Prince's house. And I've always been really fascinated by Prince.
Wait, so Prince, Stevie Wonder, and Herbie Hancock were all having dinner at Prince's house?
Yeah, apparently like talking about religion and spirituality. And I just would have loved to have been around for that conversation. So I think this was an actual dinner that may have happened at some point, and I'm just wishing I was there.
Well, you and me both. Very cool. I like that list. All right. So would you talk about the same thing, the spiritual conversation?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it would be a conversation about, I'm always generally what I like to talk, as you can tell, even though you're trying to talk about photography, I'm always trying to talk about the nature of the universe.
Yep. That's what I love about you. All right. Last question for you. So on this podcast, we like to celebrate everything that makes us unique and different. It's what we call unusual. So how would you fill in the following blank? I'm unusual because...
I'm unusual because... man, that is a tough one.
Or replace that with unique. I'm unique because...
I'd say I'm a weaver. It's not a really simple answer, but I'd say like what I do is I kind of weave stories together. So all these different stories that I do, I then try to bring them together into particular fabrics to bring out particular truths. And so maybe there's something in there.
I like that. Retrospectively looking back at your work, do you see a pattern that unfolds with all of your photography and cultures that you...
I do. I see a lot of patterns. I think what I'm trying to take it to is the eventual conclusion, though, is like, what is the shift, right? Because I do see patterns of, kind of cultural hegemony and loss and loss of identity and kind of colorfulness. They say the color of globalization is beige. And I believe that. I do think there's like, we're losing some of the colorfulness in our world. And that's one of the patterns. But the question is, how do we kind of make that turn? How do we turn that bend into something that serves us all? And I think we will. I do have faith in us as human beings.
Is your work an exhibition anywhere for people to see?
It won't be for a while. For now, they can go to the website. I think, perhaps like end of this year, early next year, they could go see some work. But right now, it's not up anywhere.
So where, before we wrap up here, if folks listening wanted to learn more about you, see the work that you've been doing, follow you on the social media webosphere, where would you direct them to go?
JoshuaCogan.com, JoshuaCogan.com. You can see my Instagram at the same, at Joshua Cogan. If you just Google my name, you'll see a bunch of like weird and interesting and different projects I've worked on. And if you want to see the feature doc we did, it's twdfilm.com, or Tomorrow We Disappear on iTunes. You can watch it. It's a really interesting exploration of the last magician's colony in northern India. There's a fair amount of magic and wonder in that as well.
I love it. So we're going to include all of those links in the show notes so people can get access to it. And Josh, thank you for taking the extra time today. And it was a delight talking to you.
Oh, thank you for being such a good guide through the process.
All right, buddy.
Really appreciate it.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Hi again. It's me, Dr. G. If you're still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.